JP, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
It's a pleasure. Thank you. I'm good.
So I'm going to first of all teach people how to pronounce your name. Tell me if I've done it right. Kuehlwein.
Almost right.
Oh,
That's part of the brand myth, So I'm quite happy. Nobody except for the Germans, obviously, and the Chinese, for whatever reason, can pronounce it well.
the Chinese. Oh,
Yes,
I'm upset. Does it mean cool wine?
it absolutely does mean cool wine. That's right. So my ancestors had a lot of fun, I suppose.
I love cool wine, so that's great. So listen, you're very interesting because you had, well, basically you were a frequent flyer by the time you were 10, but you were the only member of your family to be a frequent flyer. How does that happen? Were you stowing away in people's luggage?
Yeah, I just realized that a couple of years ago. No, my parents were divorced when I was 3 or 4, and my dad moved to Africa, North Africa, with the textile industry, which was basically closing down in Europe. So he was opening plants and running textile and cloth manufacturing plants in North America. And I spent every free minute that I had there. So any holiday, Easter, summer, winter, etc. And I still remember I flew constantly on Lufthansa, always the same flight: Frankfurt, Tunis, Frankfurt, Casablanca, etc. And by the time I was probably 10 or 12, I don't really know exactly, I was a I flew by myself, but I had the routine down. I didn't need the flight attendant to help me. And so I kept walking in front of them, go through passport control, sit down, and they were like, wow, this is a little business traveler, at the age of 12.
And do you think that shaped what happened in your, adult life as well?
Yeah, as I look back, certainly I would think so, because I loved working on brands across countries. I loved the travel associated with it. I loved the immersion into different cultures. I was surprised my American colleagues when we went to places like, India or China or Egypt, and I would pick up the street food that the vendors were selling, and I was sitting down on the floor with the people when we did in-home visits, because it felt quite natural to me. That's what I had done since I was a little child. So I didn't really have this fear of eating the local food, or this difficulty in understanding or following the local habits.
Love it. I love that. But you started your career in finance. You did, and then you moved into branding. How do you go from finance to branding?
Yeah, so the reason for finance was basically because I didn't know, frankly, what to do after my studies. And P&G, Procter and Gamble, had offered me a job in finance before I finished my studies. And so it was a choice between going on a long vacation to Australia, which I wanted to do for a couple of months, or writing a ton of letters, doing interviews, etc. So I said, what the heck, let's just start this finance job, and I can always quit. And from that, I stayed with P&G almost 25 years, to 23 odd years or so. But it took me about 2 years of a very interesting finance job right after the Iron Curtain came down, auditing businesses across Russia, Poland, Hungary, and so on. It took me about 2 years, and I said, every time we have a cross-functional meeting, it's so much more exciting and interesting when these marketing folks talk about consumer needs and advertising and marketing events and product development and how it relates to it, that I told my boss I wanted to switch. And by the way, I wanted to go either to the US or Australia. Why did I study all around the world just to end up in a Frankfurt business, in a German office? And he said, and I only realized later he meant this more or less as a joke or to be sarcastic. He said, well, why don't you apply for a marketing job in Cincinnati, which was the headquarters? And so I actually booked a summer vacation, and I went to P&G and I applied, and they gave me a job. And so I quit P&G Germany, and I hired with P&G in the US in marketing.
Fantastic, fantastic. And do you think that your finance knowledge and background helped you in your marketing?
Yes, definitely, because you know a lot of the marketers are more on the creative creative side and do not really like the numbers too much, and vice versa for finance people. And I had quite a few situations where, you know, finance people tell me I'm a dangerous marketer, and vice versa, because I can understand when they talk about NPV or the return on investment, or looking for that, or how it impacts, you know, gross and net margins and what are decent margins. But I can also explain to finance people why certain marketing measures make sense, even though they do not seem like an immediate payout. It will create a return in the long term, and so I can talk to both sides, and that's very helpful in a lot of situations. After all, marketers are often, you know, asking for budget, and so it's good to know what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I think everybody should actually have a really good understanding of finance, whatever role you play in business, because it's so important. So I think you did the right thing. Now, you said that marketing brings you bliss. Tell me what this bliss is.
Well, I once saw an interview with Seinfeld, Jerry Seinfeld, and he talked about how he was absolutely in heaven producing the Seinfeld show, because, as he said, he got paid a ton for doing basically what he likes to do, what he was doing before without getting paid, just scraping by. And I thought, you know, it's a little bit like that for me, really. And, you know, I didn't want to tell anyone at the time. You know, they pay me a lot of times for stuff I would actually pay to do, you know, like flying to exotic places, you know, visiting households there, etc. And of course, experiencing the total cultural environment around it and going in depth. I mean, I introduced diapers, the Pampers brand in India, and for that researched how it grew in places like Egypt, Pakistan, China, etc., Vietnam before. And it was absolutely fascinating. I mean, we traveled as a team all over India, and my Indian colleagues told me, JP, I've never seen as much of India and penetrated it as deeply in terms of its culture, its people, its landscapes, as we've done during this project. And so, yeah, I felt absolutely blessed being even paid to do that.
I think part of it, I suppose, you're quite curious, so you want to know and want to know what's going on. So that feeds your curiosity a bit, doesn't it? Finding out more about people. That's lovely.
Absolutely, yeah. I now teach at NYU, for example, and at the beginning of the course, when I introduce myself, I like to show them pictures where, you know, we're walking through the fields in Vietnam, and you know, we're eating the street food in Heilongjiang province, and I tell them that it's the tallest Chinese people you've ever seen. They're all 6 foot something and taller and enormous. And I show them supermarkets there. It's all written in Russian, and I explain why that is, and they find it absolutely fascinating. But I find it still fascinating today, you know.
Brilliant, brilliant. And you talk about Uber brands, Uber being another German word, which hopefully I pronounced okay this time. What do you mean by an Uber brand, and what makes a brand Uber?
Right. So here you go again with the umlaut. That's the Uber in it. Uber is a peculiar German word. It means above and beyond. There's not really one translation in that interpretation of it. And that's exactly what these brands are that I'm talking about. These are brands that acquire meaning way beyond their functionality or their utilitarian benefit. So, and that's what they have in common. We kind of find them peerless and priceless, no matter whether they're luxury. So think about, you know, a Birkin bag, think about a 911 Porsche, or they are more common goods, like let's say a Patagonia sweater or Ben & Jerry's ice cream. what these products have, and these brands, more importantly, have in common is that they aspire to be a lot more than a handbag, an ice cream, a sweater, or a piece of jewelry. They acquire meaning way beyond that, and that's what Uber stands for. It was inspired when Wolfgang and I, my co-author, thought about these brands. We thought of Nietzsche, who talks about the Übermensch. Now, obviously, Übermensch has been abused quite a bit in history, but if you look behind the concept, it's all about people who are able to bring humanity forward, whether it's in the arts or in philosophy or sports. They go beyond the daily routine and break out of it. And that's how these brands feel. Red Bull wants to be more than a soft drink. And so that's what we find over and over. And that's why we call them Uber brands, and to annoy the Anglo-Saxons a bit who can't pronounce it.
You're so cheeky. I'm Italian, by the way, and I still can't pronounce it. So it seems for me that everybody is finding their mission. All the brands, all the businesses are finding their missions. They're all finding their purpose, and everybody's trying to save the world. And some of it doesn't feel authentic to me. What are the Uber brands doing in this regard? Are they authentic? They're doing it right. Is that what makes them special?
Yeah, that's one of the key differences that we see between these kind of brands, the Uber brands, and kind of all the others that aspire to be similar. And that is that they truly live this higher mission. First of all, they have a mission and a myth, as we call it, that is unique and that is truly ownable for the brand. So it goes beyond the kind of lip service of, or the generalities of, we want to save the world, or the unrelated, fill your tank with the gas and I'll plant a tree in Brazil. It really has meaning. When you look at, let's say, a mundane product like Ben & Jerry's ice cream, they have been very deeply involved in social justice causes since their founding, and you can see them stand for it and actually, risk their business quite a bit, i.e. they put their money where their mouth is as well, and they do things where other brands don't follow them in, for example, protesting against the current government, which to a lot of brands that might seem dangerous to do. The same for Patagonia, for example. Or it doesn't need to be political or ideological. If you look at Brunello Cucinelli, since you're Italian, he lives a fantasy world, in his little village in Umbria, and he has this dream of how things should be made and how things should be treated and sold and crafted. But he puts his money, his organization, his treating of his own workers where his thoughts and his mouth is, and that's where the difference come in. The other big difference is that these companies don't follow every whim and need and trend of the consumer. So where the typical mass brand tries to find and catch the trend, and if this season is blue, they'll go blue, and if this season everyone talks about one thing or the other, they'll talk about that, or use the celebrity that is known for a particular cause or act. When you think of a Ben & Jerry's or a Patagonia or Hermes, they have been very consistent over time, and they don't go with the whims of the consumer. In fact, sometimes think of Apple and Steve Jobs, they'll go against the consumer if they think it's right. If you want more buttons, then buy a Samsung, don't buy an iPhone, which, Steve Jobs is credited as having said, or, I don't do focus groups. So they very much also have this confidence of doing the right thing and lead versus follow in a lot of respects.
I like that, lead versus follow. I think you're absolutely right. You've mentioned quite a lot of brand names there. What are your favorite Uber brands?
It's tough because I stumble on over new ones all the time. But to give you very different brands, I love Airbnb. I love Airbnb for what it has created, which is this new concept of a network as a brand. If you think about it, it doesn't own any hotel rooms. It doesn't really control its brand because its brands are by now millions of people that own its brand. Nevertheless, it's able through kind of living a community to actually be quite present and quite defined in the mind of most of its users. So Airbnb is a great one. A forever favorite is Patagonia, simply as being a brand that really lives its purpose with incredible consistency and consequence for them. You know, they're often giving away their profits. They treat their employees and their workers extremely fairly. I mean, they had organic food and daycare centers before Google existed, you know, before these concepts of a company campus and so on were a fashion since the 70s and 80s. So that is a fantastic brand. And I just discovered one this week in New York, which is called Haven's Kitchen, which is actually an NYU graduate who established a kitchen where she teaches people to do simple cooking. She says cooking without a recipe, because we kind of unlearned for a whole generation cooking, you know, with the TV frozen dinners and everyone working and really the focus being not so much on nutrition. And she said, I don't want to do fancy cooking or anything. I want to help people learn the basics again. So she does wonderful products as well, sauces and things. And she made me discover a yogurt, which is absolutely incredible. So I come across Uber brands all the time during my work and research.
Fantastic. And you also mentioned, obviously, the customer, and the customer is vital in this. And you talk about going beyond knowing your consumers. What do you mean by going beyond that?
Yeah, so knowing your consumer is very important. And I talked at the beginning about this, you know, so when I worked on Pampers, for example, understanding, or on laundry detergents, which I both did in emerging markets, it's important to understand the habits. It's quite different, literally, people sitting by the side of a river and washing their clothes with a bar soap when you grew up in an environment where there was always a washing machine. So it's very important to understand that, to actually do it yourself. And I did. And it's one of these experiences that I talked about earlier. On the other hand, particularly Uber brands, which, remember, they have in common that they are priceless. So people are willing to pay a premium for them. You expect of them also that they guide you and they show you the way to some extent. So it would be disappointing for, let's say, Hermes brand or Chanel brand to ask you, Maria, do you want this in red or blue? And when you say blue, they give it to you in blue. And if they say, do you want wool or you want linen? You know, it doesn't work like that. You want to be inspired by these brands. You want to be guided by these brands. You actually want them to be mind and heart opening and teach you new things, or at least inspire you, give you new ideas if they're not teaching you anything. And so what we find is that these brands know the difference also between the aspiring, what we call Uber target, the people that you have in mind when you design, think, create for this brand, and the actual user. So a simple way to show it is, think of Harley Davidson, which is an Uber brand. And when you and I talk about the Harley Davidson rider, I can ask you, does this person have a beard, or is he shaven? And you'll know the answer. Is he a smoker or a non-smoker? You'll know the answer. Is the favorite color black or red? We all know the answer. Nevertheless, when we think, and you say, you know, what job does he have? Well, ideally none. Does he own a gun? Of course. But when you think of the people who actually spend their money on Harley Davidson, and so let's think of finance, who makes that company money, who buys new Harley Davidson that are the highest margin and even customizes it, which costs even more. They are men who have a midlife crisis, who are dentists, stockbrokers, managers, and who look nothing like these people. They don't have tattoos, at least not ones that they can't wash off on Monday when they need to go back to the office. So that is the difference between the target, the consumer that you should know, and the Uber target that you should know even better as a brand to aspire to this consumer. And those are concepts that when I work with mass manufacturers and mass brands in CPG in particular, are very tough to not understand but live by, because we were so trained to try and please the consumer and follow whatever they tell us. And that's not true for Uber brands, not in that direct way anyway.
That's fascinating. I do like the idea that there's an Uber target, and anybody who's listened to this won't know that every time you asked a question of the Harley Davidson driver, I was giving you the answer. I was mouthing the answer, and it's true. You absolutely know. It is a great example.
I do this with my students all the time, and it's always a good laugh because they all know. It actually goes back to a concept in psychology from the 80s and earlier, Marcus and Nurius, which is about the ideal self. So we all have our self, and sometimes when we pity ourselves, it's that kind of self that we fear we are, and then there's kind of the actual self that if we try to look at it rationally and we ask our friends, we hear we are or think we are. But then all of us carry an ideal of ourselves. And that is where the brand targets. That is, the Red Bull person who's like a crazy stunt person who literally jumps out of the stratosphere, right? Red Bull shows you. When you want to be that person, whether you go to a party or whatever it might be, or even just survive this, prepping for this test overnight, you grab a Red Bull, intuitively feeling and thinking about that Uber target. And so that's the ideal self, or even the fantasy self that we have just before we fall asleep, kind of the daydream self that we have. And so this concept has been around for quite a long time. It is now that it comes to the fore, also driven by social media, because when you look at Instagram, for example, your Instagram stream is most likely a reflection of your idealized self. In fact, people get so hung up on it, they get so into it that they need to manage their Instagram feed, and it becomes almost a job in itself to live this pretend idealized world on your Instagram feed.
So what are brands doing then on social media? Are they presenting an idealized world for their consumers? Is that what they're doing? So they're doing the same thing as we're all doing?
Yes, so in a lot of ways they do that. And it's always been the business of the luxury brand. If you think about luxury brands, really the codes were not that difficult to detect. Let's say, for example, the difference between luxury print ads of the old type or social media of the earlier type is they all look very broody and almost dismissive of you. Like luxury brand models, they look away in the picture or they look down on you. They don't look very happy. And that's because psychologically, it's what we respect. These people exude self-confidence and a grandeur that we aspire to. If you compare it to mass brands, there's always happy-go-lucky smiling of the family, ideally with a dog going on. And in the beauty business, for example, we say with every millimeter, that the smile goes up and you start to see the teeth, the price of the product goes down 10% because happy-go-lucky can't ask the same kind of price premium. I think that has changed a little bit because a new component in marketing that has come in is this opportunity for consumers to dig deeper and find and look behind the scenes, literally, and find out more. How do you produce? How do you behave as an organization? What is really going on? How do you pay your people? Do women really get paid fairly? Are they on your board? I'm referring to actual advertising controversies going on. And so I think it has shifted a little bit, like I said, to the king now is to authentically live this mission and this world that you project. And that's where Brunello Cucinelli, for example, is in a great place, or Freitag, the bags, the messenger bags, are in a great place because they even open their doors and say, look at my manufacturing, talk to my people, talk to my designers. We truly are what we're talking about. And that's where a lot of quote unquote normal brands have a hard time. They can't open their doors because their world was purely created by an ad agency. And by the way, it changed every couple of years because they either changed ad agencies or marketing directors or creative directors. And so they're not very consistent, and there's nothing to poke at behind the scenes. And so they're much thinner and flatter and less meaty as a brand.
Fascinating, really fascinating. So you coach brand builders, and you've obviously got some wonderful highlights from the countries that you've worked in and the people that you work with. Can you share some insights on the successes, the failures, and some of the things that have happened?
Yes. So, I mean, there are incredible moments. For example, literally, my team shipped the first official Pampers diaper into the Indian market, which is the market with the most babies in the world. And I still remember we had our president of that Procter & Gamble division over for shortly after that moment for an in-market visit. And, you know, Pampers is a roughly $12 billion business. So it would be a Fortune 500 company just by itself. And he was in the car, and we were visiting these stores, and we showed him where, you know, Pampers popped up even in these very tiny Kirana stores in India. And he said, he almost couldn't believe it that we really had succeeded in getting this kind of a distribution. So at one point he said, would you mind we just stop anywhere in the street where I say and go to a store and see if the same thing happens? Because he wondered whether we staged it all. And we said, no, let's do it. And we went to a store, and I was like, oh my God, I hope they have Pampers. And sure enough, they had Pampers. And he got back in the car, and he had a little tear in his eye. And he said, you know, guys, there's only so many times in history that you can go to a market which is the biggest baby market with the biggest diaper brand and ship the first diaper. So I had incredible moments like that. And then I had intimate moments where there were incredible consumer insights that that really moved me. So for example, I worked on a test product which was a paper bib that was for feeding babies, and that was supposed to be based on the Bounty paper towel brand that P&G has in the United States. And we were testing this product to see how it's going, etc. And we used ethnography, where we went to people's homes and we observed them for long times. I mean, sometimes for 5-6 hours in one row. And we tried to be kind of the fly on the wall, and then we filmed them. And then we showed them their own film, and we talked it through. And long story short, moms were very torn about this product. On the one hand, they loved it, particularly working moms, because it allowed them to be fast and you know, not do the cleanup and all of these things that as a busy mom, working mom, they didn't want to deal with. On the other hand, they had this invisible barrier. And as we probed into that, it showed that the crinkling of the paper on the baby's chest while they were feeding, in the super intimate moment, the few minutes that they really had after coming home from work with their baby before it falls asleep, felt like an artificial barrier. It made them feel cheap. It made them feel like they put something disposable on their baby during this moment. And we absolutely needed to soften this product and get rid of this sound, this crinkly paper sound that irritated or at least triggered this feeling of cheapness. And so we understood what was wrong about this product, that we just couldn't get to really work and get into the habit of moms. So there are these incredible moments, whether it's on the up or the down, that are really mind-opening and a lot of fun to live and then work on.
Fascinating insights. So tell me, JP, when clients invite you to speak at their events, what are they asking you to talk about specifically? Because you've got so much breadth. What are the things that they're most coming to you for?
Yeah, so it depends a little bit on the client. I would say there are some segments of clients. A lot of clients are in the camp of I have successful brands, or I have former iconic brands that are struggling. And I do understand, and I already have embraced this concept that my brand needs to have a purpose, or my company needs to have a purpose. But I do not see it impact. Well, what are we doing wrong? And so what I talk about there and what I show them is that it's not so much about what you say, but about what you do, and about the signals, the rituals, the organization, the investments, and the communication also, but not only, that impacts how people perceive your brand. And I'm showing them a very broad range. That's what I always like to do, of examples, from literally Tiffany jewelry to dog food, to show them it doesn't matter, or to toilet paper. No kidding, I actually have it here. To show them that it doesn't matter what kind of brand you are, which price point you're at, whether you're at $2 or $200. It matters that you think about how do you bring this purpose to life, and how can it be manifested, and that you choose the right purpose. Many brands actually go over the top and choose something that they cannot really own and live up to. And we need to be more humble in that case. The other common theme is what we talked earlier about understanding the difference between serving the needs of customers and consumers, and understanding who your true fans, your Uber target are, and to understand from them what you are really all about as a brand, and what can be the aspiration behind your brand. And so, for example, one typical question I get from the audience, and I always reserve at least 30% of the time on Q&As that are usually very animated, is, but this might be relevant to only 4, 5, 6% of my consumers. Most consumers don't even know that Patagonia wants to protect the environment. They just buy that sweater because it's a nice red or blue. And I tell them that doesn't matter, because it is these very engaged bloggers, journalists, super fans, disciples of the brand that create the image. And it might be because, George Clooney drives a Tesla, that you want the Tesla as well. And it's only George who buys into that vision of the future that Elon Musk has, etc., and others might be clueless about it. But it is from him and Elon Musk's mission that everything starts. And so we're talking a lot about these differences between the massive approach of, unless everyone agrees, it's not valid for my brand, to it's a few things that have a very important lighthouse function for your brand.
I love it. Brilliant.
And then obviously there are many aspects of execution, whether it's how to design your communication, or one subject that I love, that I work together with partners, is how do you bring it to life when you are a building, a place, a space, an event? Because this is where on the other side of the spectrum, a lot of digital brands need to go. They have a great virtual platform, but they realize people want to touch, feel, and experience. And so there we look at, how do you translate now your platform into a physical brand?
Fantastic. Rapidly running out of time. So my final question is, what's next?
Yeah, good question. So what's next is a lot of things concurrently, which is usually the case for me. We're writing a follow-up book because we got a lot of questions about how to implement Uber branding and give more examples of Uber brand, even though the first book is already chock-a-block full of that. So we're in the process of doing that, including brands like, for example, Airbnb that I just talked about, which is really exciting, and listening to them and hearing from them. a lot of consulting projects that are interesting. Particularly now, I reserve a percentage of my time to kind of do projects with founders and with entrepreneurs, and actually across the world. So there's very interesting projects going on with vases and lifestyle products in Australia and beauty products in the UK, etc. And then teaching. I love doing teaching, so I promise to myself that I'll ramp that up further. And I do brand and marketing teaching also on the side, which we will see when the breaking moment comes. But for now, I love adding that on.
Well, listen, I've taken a lot of your time. You're a very busy man. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. This was a pleasure.